The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It hammered against the windows of Belrose Manor with the persistence of creditors at the door, which, Margaret thought distantly, was perhaps fitting. The entire house smelled of damp wood and desperation, though the latter might have been her imagination, or perhaps not. Her father had worn the same waistcoat for a week now, and her mother's jewelry had mysteriously diminished, one piece at a time, like autumn leaves falling from a dying tree. Margaret stood in the doorway of her father's study, watching him work by candlelight, though it was only 4 in the afternoon. The storm had turned the day into premature twilight, casting everything in shades of gray and shadow. Silas Belrose sat hunched over his desk, his thinning hair catching the amber glow as his quill scratched across parchment with the methodical precision of a butcher tallying cuts of meat. She knew what he was writing. She had known for 3 weeks, ever since the man in the black carriage had first arrived and closeted himself with her father for 6 hours, while her mother paced the hallway like a cat waiting for a mouse to emerge from its hole. The family ledger lay open before him, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with what might have been wine, or might have been tears from some ancestor with more sentiment than sense. Generation upon generation of Belroses inscribed in careful script. Births, marriages, deaths. The sacred record of bloodline and inheritance. Her father dipped his quill in the inkwell, tapped it twice against the rim with fastidious care, and drew a single black line through her name. Margaret Abigail Belrose. The line was neat, perfectly horizontal, as if he had practiced. Perhaps he had. Her father was nothing if not thorough when it came to matters of accounting. A daughter who could not produce heirs was a liability that depreciated with every passing year. And Silas Belrose had never been a man to hold on to depreciating assets. "You're lurking, Margaret." He did not look up from his work. "It's unbecoming." "I thought nothing I did could be any more unbecoming than what I am." The words came out flatter than she intended, empty of the bitterness she'd thought she would feel at this moment. But perhaps she had exhausted her supply of bitterness weeks ago, when the physician had emerged from her mother's sitting room, shaking his head, when her father had stopped meeting her eyes at dinner, when her younger sister Beatrice had been moved into the larger bedroom that had been hers since childhood. "The childbed fever damaged your womb beyond repair," her mother had announced, as if Margaret might have somehow forgotten the 6 months of agony when she was 12 years old. "No man of quality will have you now. We must be practical." Practical. Such a clean word for what was happening. My lovely family, before we continue with this story, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel so that you do not miss stories like this one. Silas set down his quill and finally looked at her. His eyes were pale blue, watery, and held no more warmth than a January pond. "Your mother has packed what she deemed appropriate for your new circumstances. You should be grateful we found anyone willing to take you at all." "Take me." Margaret folded her hands at her waist, pressing her fingers together until the tips went white. "An interesting turn of phrase, Father. I believe the legal terminology is purchase." His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might actually show some emotion, anger, perhaps, or shame. But he simply reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold sovereigns. The Duke of Crestmont is a man of impeccable lineage and considerable wealth. That he has made an unconventional arrangement is no concern of yours. You will be a duchess. Girls of better birth and sounder constitution have married far worse. How much? The question slipped out before she could stop it. How much am I worth? Margaret? No, truly I'm curious. What is the market rate for a defective daughter these days? Surely you negotiated. You always negotiate." Silas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He was not a tall man, but he drew himself up as if height might lend authority to his words. "You will not speak to me in that tone. Everything I have done has been for this family. The Cole rights alone will secure your sister's dowry and restore." He caught himself, but too late. "Restore what, Father? The fortune you lost at the gaming tables? The investments that failed because you trusted the wrong men? Or perhaps the loans you took from people who don't appreciate late payments?" She had heard the arguments through the walls, late at night when her parents thought she was asleep. She knew exactly how deep the Belrose debts ran. The slap came without warning, sharp and sudden as a thunderclap. Her head snapped to the side, and she tasted copper where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. But she did not cry out. She had learned years ago that tears only encouraged them. Silas's hand trembled as he lowered it. "You will compose yourself before the Duke arrives. You will be demure, obedient, and grateful. Do you understand?" Margaret touched her cheek, feeling the heat rising beneath her fingers. Through the window behind her father, she could see the sweep of the drive, and there, emerging from the gray veil of rain like a ship from fog, was a carriage. Black as morning clothes, pulled by 4 horses the color of smoke. It rolled toward the manor with inexorable purpose. No crest on the door, no footman in livery, just that black box on wheels, coming to collect its purchase. "He's here," she said quietly. Silas turned to look, and for just an instant, something like doubt flickered across his features. But then the familiar coldness reasserted itself. He closed the family ledger with a decisive thump, the sound of a book being shut on a finished chapter. "Then let us conclude our business." The chapel was older than anyone could remember, built when the Belroses had actually been people of consequence rather than people pretending at it. Cold seeped up through the stone floor despite the summer month, as if the earth itself disapproved of what was taking place within these walls. Margaret stood at the altar in a dress that had been her grandmother's, hastily altered by a seamstress who had been paid too little to care about the uneven hem or the way the lace scratched against her collarbones. The ivory silk had yellowed with age, and there was a stain near the bodice that someone had tried to disguise with an unfortunately placed ribbon. She looked, she thought distantly, exactly like what she was. Goods being sold past their prime, dressed up to hide the damage. The Duke stood beside her. She had not gotten a proper look at him when he arrived. Her mother had intercepted her in the hallway, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise while hissing instructions about posture and keeping her eyes downcast, and for God's sake not mentioning anything about her condition. By the time Margaret had been deposited in the chapel's anteroom, Edmund Calder had already been positioned at the altar. A dark figure in darker clothing, waiting with the patience of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he paid for. Now, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, she could see him properly. Tall, easily a head taller than her father, with shoulders that strained against his coat in a way that suggested he did not spend his days bent over ledgers. His hair was black as the carriage that had brought him, swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and harder lines. Handsome, she supposed, in the way that a blade was handsome. Elegant, purposeful, and potentially lethal. He had not looked at her once. The priest droned through the ceremony with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grocery list. Father Benedict had known Margaret since she was christened in this very chapel, had watched her grow from a laughing child into a silent ghost haunting her parents' hallways. He would not meet her eyes either. No one would. Her mother sat in the front pew, weeping delicately into a handkerchief. Elizabeth Belrose had always been skilled at performing grief, though Margaret suspected these tears were less about losing a daughter and more about the relief of finally being rid of an expensive problem. Beside her, Silas sat rigid and unmoving, his gaze fixed on the stained glass window above the altar, as if seeking divine approval for what he had done. Beatrice was not present. Too young to witness such proceedings, her mother had claimed. Though Beatrice was only 2 years Margaret's junior and had been deemed old enough to take over Margaret's bedroom, Margaret's jewelry box, Margaret's place at the dinner table. The Duke's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "I do." 2 words, spoken in a tone that suggested he was confirming a business transaction rather than pledging his eternal devotion. His voice was deep, cultured, with the barest hint of a northern accent that softened the harder consonants. He still had not looked at her. Father Benedict turned his watery gaze to Margaret. "And do you, Margaret Abigail Belrose, take this man?" "She does," her father interrupted from his pew. The priest faltered, mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "I must hear it from the bride herself, Lord Belrose. The vows require—" "I do." Margaret spoke clearly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She would not give them the satisfaction of her hesitation, would not let them see her break. If she was to be sold, she would at least maintain the dignity of accepting her own fate. The Duke's eyes flicked toward her for the first time. They were gray, she noticed. The color of the storm that had raged for 3 days, the color of steel and smoke and things that did not bend easily. Something passed across his expression, assessment perhaps, or merely acknowledgement that the object he had purchased could indeed speak. Then he looked away again. "The ring," Father Benedict prompted weakly. Edmund reached into his coat and produced a band of gold so simple it might have been mocking. No jewels, no engraving, just a circle of metal that he slipped onto her finger with the efficiency of a man signing a contract. It was slightly too large. Margaret curled her finger to keep it from sliding off. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The priest spoke quickly, as if speed might somehow sanctify what had just occurred. "You may." But the Duke had already turned away, striding down the aisle toward the chapel doors without waiting for permission to kiss his bride. Margaret stood frozen at the altar, the 2 large rings spinning on her finger, watching her husband's retreating back. Her mother's sobs grew louder, more theatrical. Her father stood and buttoned his coat with the satisfied air of a man who had just concluded a profitable negotiation. Neither of them moved toward her. "Your Grace?" Father Benedict's hand hovered near her elbow, not quite touching. "The carriage is waiting." "Of course it is." Margaret gathered the stained silk of her grandmother's dress and followed the Duke's path down the aisle. Her footsteps echoed in the empty chapel, each one a small farewell to the girl she had been. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained gray and threatening. The black carriage waited like a patient beast, its door already open. The Duke stood beside it, speaking in low tones to a driver who nodded and climbed up to the box. Margaret emerged into the damp air and stopped, suddenly aware that she had no idea what happened next. Did she wait to be handed in? Did she climb in herself? Were there expectations for a wedding night she was meant to fulfill, despite the very reason she had been sold in the first place? "Your Grace," she began, then stopped. The title felt foreign on her tongue, ill-fitting as the ring on her finger. Edmund turned, and for the second time, those gray eyes settled on her with the weight of an appraisal. "Get in the carriage, Margaret." Not unkind, but not kind either. Simply a statement of fact, an instruction to be followed. We leave immediately. But my things... She glanced back at the manor, at the windows where she could see her mother's face pressed against the glass. Surely they'll bring my trunk. There is no trunk. The words hit like a physical blow. Margaret's hand went to her throat, fingers catching on the borrowed pearls her mother had clasped there that morning. I don't understand. Yes, you do. Edmund gestured to the carriage with barely contained impatience. Your parents sold you, Margaret. Did you truly expect them to include your wardrobe in the transaction? The journey to Crestmont Abbey took 6 hours, and during that time, the Duke spoke exactly once. There is water in the compartment beneath your seat. Margaret had nodded, too numb to be thirsty, and spent the remainder of the journey watching the landscape transform from the manicured mediocrity of her father's estate to something wilder, more unforgiving. The roads grew narrower, the trees denser, until finally the carriage climbed into hill country where stone walls divided fields like scars across old flesh. Crestmont Abbey emerged from the twilight like something from a cautionary tale. It was not the crumbling ruin she had half expected, but neither was it welcoming. Built of gray stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, it sprawled across the hilltop with the austere grandeur of a fortress disguised as a home. Dozens of windows stared down at the approaching carriage, dark and empty as closed eyes. A single servant waited at the entrance, an elderly woman in severe black who curtsied with the mechanical precision of long practice. She took one look at Margaret's borrowed dress and yellowed pearls, and something like pity flickered across her weathered face. Mrs. Hendricks will show you to your rooms, Edmund said, already moving toward a different wing of the house. Dinner is at 8. Someone will fetch you. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who looked as disapproving as Margaret's own family, though presumably for different reasons. Mrs. Hendricks led her up a grand staircase worn smooth by generations of Calders, down a hallway where the wallpaper was faded but clean, and finally into a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire bedroom had been at Belrose Manor. A fire had been laid in the grate, and someone had placed fresh flowers on the mantel. Small kindnesses that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. The Duke's chambers are through that door, Mrs. Hendricks said, indicating a connecting door that Margaret had been trying very hard not to look at. Though His Grace rarely uses it, he prefers the east wing. Margaret could not tell if this was meant to be reassuring or damning. I see. There are clothes in the wardrobe. The Duke had them made up when he was in London last month. I took the liberty of estimating your measurements. The housekeeper's tone suggested this had been an unusual request, but one she had fulfilled without question. Will you require assistance dressing for dinner? No, thank you. Margaret had been dressing herself since her parents dismissed her lady's maid 3 years ago, citing unnecessary expense. I can manage. Mrs. Hendricks studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. You're younger than I expected. I'm 20. Though she felt ancient, hollowed out and brittle as the abandoned birds' nests that collected in the eaves of her father's crumbling estate. Young enough to start over, then. The housekeeper moved toward the door, then paused. His Grace is not an easy man, Your Grace, but he is not a cruel one. There are worse fates than Crestmont Abbey. She left before Margaret could ask what exactly that meant. Dinner was a silent affair in a dining room, built to seat 40, but set for 2. They sat at opposite ends of a table so long that conversation would have required shouting. Margaret pushed food around her plate, some kind of roasted game bird that she could not identify, while Edmund methodically consumed his meal with the same efficiency he seemed to apply to everything else. When the servants cleared the final course, he stood. Come with me. It was not a request. Margaret followed him through corridors lit by candles in wall sconces, past rooms shrouded in holland covers, until they reached a library that smelled of leather and old paper. And something else. Tobacco, perhaps, or brandy, or simply the accumulated weight of centuries. Edmund moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid without asking if she wanted one. He handed her a glass, then positioned himself before the fireplace, staring into flames that cast dancing shadows across his angular features. "You are wondering," he said finally, "why I chose you?" Margaret took a sip of whatever he had given her. It burned going down, but the warmth was not entirely unpleasant. The thought had crossed my mind. Your father was very thorough in his correspondence. He made it abundantly clear that you were damaged goods, infertile, worthless in the marriage market. He seemed to think this would lower my offer. Edmund's mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile. He was incorrect. You paid more because I'm barren? The word tasted bitter, even with the brandy to wash it down. I paid what I did because your infertility was precisely what I required. He turned to face her fully, and in the firelight his eyes looked almost black. I need you to understand something, Margaret. This marriage is not what your romantic notions might have imagined. I do not need an heir. In fact, I cannot afford to have one. I don't understand. Edmund set his glass down with careful precision. My family is cursed, not in the superstitious peasant sense, but in a very literal, very legal sense that has resulted in the deaths of 3 of my cousins, 2 uncles, and my own father. Margaret felt the brandy sour in her stomach. What are you talking about? The Crestmont inheritance is substantial. Lands, mines, investments that span 3 countries. When my grandfather died, he made the catastrophic decision to divide certain assets among his sons rather than leaving everything to the eldest. He thought it would prevent rivalry. Instead, it created a bloodbath. Edmund's voice remained level, but his hands clenched at his sides. My uncle poisoned my father to claim the northern estates. My cousin arranged an accident that killed his own brother for control of the copper mines. Every generation, we tear ourselves apart over pieces of an empire that should have remained whole. And you think a child would. I know what a child would do. An heir makes me vulnerable, creates a pawn that can be kidnapped, manipulated, used as leverage, creates a reason for my remaining cousins to eliminate me so they can position themselves as regents. He moved closer, and Margaret resisted the urge to step back. I have 14 living relatives who would benefit from my death. 14 people who have proven themselves willing to commit murder for a larger share of the Crestmont fortune. So you married a woman who cannot give you children. Margaret's mind raced, connecting the pieces. A woman who makes you useless to their schemes. A woman who removes the incentive for my assassination. Yes. Edmund's expression softened slightly, though it still could not be called gentle. I know what your parents told you. That you are broken, worthless, a burden to be disposed of. But to me, Margaret, your supposed defect is the most valuable thing you possess. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt a strange, hollow ache beneath her ribs. So this is a business arrangement. Nothing more. I will not lie to you and claim affection I do not feel. We are strangers bound by legal documents and mutual advantage. But I will also not mistreat you. You will have freedom here that you never had under your father's roof. Money of your own. Authority over this household. Respect, if not love. And in exchange, you remain childless, You present a united front to my family, and you never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to be used against me." He finished his brandy in one swallow. "Can you do that?" Margaret looked around the library, at the thousands of books lining the walls, at the comfortable chairs, and the warm fire, and the windows that looked out over lands that stretched to the horizon. She thought of her father's study, of her name crossed out in the family ledger, of Beatrice sleeping in her bed while her parents counted their coal rights and congratulated themselves on a profitable transaction. She thought of the word worthless, and how it had followed her like a shadow for 8 years. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." Edmund nodded once, as if a contract had been signed. "Then welcome to Crestmont Abbey, Your Grace. Try not to get murdered." Margaret woke to silence so complete it felt like drowning. At Belrose Manor, mornings had been punctuated by the creaking of servants rushing to complete tasks with inadequate staff, her mother's shrill voice berating someone for some imagined slight, her father's heavy tread on the stairs as he descended to begin another day of pretending solvency. Here, there was nothing. Just the whisper of wind against ancient stone and the distant cawing of crows in the gardens below. She dressed herself in one of the gowns Edmund had commissioned, a simple day dress in deep blue that actually fit, a luxury she had not experienced in years. The mirror showed her a stranger, a woman who looked like a duchess rather than a discarded daughter. She was not certain she recognized herself. Mrs. Hendricks appeared as Margaret emerged from her rooms, materializing with the uncanny timing of all good servants. "His Grace left for the northern properties before dawn," the housekeeper said without preamble. "He'll be gone 3 days. He said you were to make yourself familiar with the house." A pause, weighted with meaning. All of it. So she was to be left alone in this vast stone monument to a family that killed each other over copper mines and coal rights. Margaret should have felt abandoned. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to relief. She began in the portrait gallery, walking past generations of Calders who stared down with varying degrees of hauteur and hostility. Edmund's father was easy to identify. The same sharp features, the same uncompromising mouth, though his eyes held a hardness that Edmund's lacked. Or perhaps Edmund simply hid it better. Beside him hung an empty frame, its canvas removed, leaving only a rectangle of darker wallpaper to mark where someone's likeness had once resided. "The Duke's uncle," Mrs. Hendricks said softly. She had followed at a discreet distance, appearing whenever Margaret entered a new room. His Grace had it burned after the trial, said he wouldn't have a murderer looking down on his breakfast. Margaret studied the empty space. Were they close? Before? They were children together, the Duke's father and his uncle. They played in these very halls. The housekeeper's voice carried the weight of old grief. That's what makes it worse, isn't it? That love can turn to poison over something as cold as money. The music room held a pianoforte, thick with dust. The conservatory housed plants that had long since died from neglect, their brittle leaves crumbling at a touch. The ballroom could have held 100 dancers, but the floor was dull, and the chandeliers were draped in cloth like shrouded corpses. Everywhere Margaret looked, she saw the evidence of a house that had forgotten how to be a home. She found the estate office on the second day. It was tucked away in the east wing, past Edmund's chambers and down a corridor lined with maps of properties she had never heard of. The door was unlocked, and inside she discovered a chaos that made her father's disorganized study look pristine by comparison. Papers covered every surface, ledgers stacked in precarious towers, correspondence bundled with string but apparently never answered. The desk itself had disappeared beneath layers of documents, bills, reports from stewards and managers and solicitors, all seemingly abandoned mid-review. Margaret stood in the doorway, taking it in with a mixture of horror and something else. Something that felt dangerously like purpose. Her father had never allowed her near his accounts. "Mathematics are unbecoming in a woman," he had declared, even as she had tried to show him the errors in his calculations, the investments that made no sense, the debts he was ignoring. But she had learned anyway, stealing his ledgers when he was out, teaching herself the language of credits and debits and compound interest during the long nights when sleep would not come. She moved to the desk and began to sort. By evening, she had created order from chaos. Bills arranged by date and urgency, correspondence divided into categories, estate management, business ventures, legal matters, and a disturbingly large pile labeled threats from relatives. The ledgers revealed a financial empire even more vast than Edmund had suggested, and one that was being badly mismanaged in his absence. "Your Grace?" Mrs. Hendricks appeared in the doorway bearing a tea tray, then stopped short at the sight of Margaret surrounded by papers, ink staining her fingers, her hair escaping its pins. "What are you doing?" "Someone needs to." Margaret held up a bill dated from 8 months prior. "Did you know the South tenants haven't had their roofs repaired despite 3 requests? Or that the steward of the Kentish properties has been inflating his expense reports by approximately 30%? She shuffled through another stack. "And, according to this, Edmund owns a shipping company that he seems to have completely forgotten about. It's been operating without oversight for 2 years. The housekeeper set down the tea tray with trembling hands. "The Duke doesn't. He handles the major properties himself. But the smaller concerns are being stolen from, mismanaged, or ignored entirely." Margaret took a sip of tea, barely tasting it. "He's too busy watching for assassins to notice he's being robbed by his own employees." "You cannot mean to." Mrs. Hendricks gestured helplessly at the reorganized office. "Your Grace, this is hardly appropriate work for a duchess." "What else am I to do? Embroider? Plan dinner parties for a husband who eats in silence in a household that has no guests?" Margaret heard the sharpness in her own voice and tried to soften it. "I am here, Mrs. Hendricks. I am married to a man who does not want my company and cannot have my children. But I can read a ledger. I can spot fraud. And I can fix what has been broken through neglect." The housekeeper studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, she smiled. "The previous Duchess, His Grace's mother, she used to say that the Crestmont curse wasn't the inheritance at all. It was that the men of the family could only see enemies, never opportunities." She moved toward a cabinet in the corner and withdrew a ring of keys. "These open the locked files, the ones His Grace keeps from the stewards. If you're going to do this properly, you'll need to see everything." Margaret took the keys, feeling their weight in her palm. "Won't he be angry?" "Perhaps. But I suspect he'll be more angry if another cousin tries to poison him because someone didn't notice suspicious payments to an apothecary." Mrs. Hendricks moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Your Grace, I think you're exactly what this house has needed, even if no one knew to ask for it." Alone again, Margaret turned back to the desk. Through the window, she could see the neglected gardens sprawling toward the horizon, beautiful despite their abandonment. Or perhaps because of it. Wild roses had overtaken the formal beds, climbing the stone walls with determined grace. They had not asked permission to bloom. She opened the first locked ledger and began to read. By the time Edmund returned 3 days later, Margaret had uncovered embezzlement in 2 estates, identified a fraudulent solicitor who had been billing for services never rendered, and drafted letters to 14 tenants whose legitimate concerns had been ignored. She had also discovered that the Crestmont fortune was even larger than she had imagined, and more vulnerable. She found him in the library, still in his traveling clothes, pouring whiskey with the weary movements of a man who had not slept well. "I need to speak with you," she said from the doorway. He turned, surprise flickering across his features. In 3 days, he had likely forgotten he had a wife. "Margaret, I trust Mrs. Hendricks saw to your needs. Your steward in Yorkshire is stealing from you. Your solicitor in London is inventing fees, and someone has been making substantial payments to a chemist in Edinburgh who specializes in untraceable poisons." She moved into the room, carrying the ledgers she had marked with paper slips. "Also, you own a textile mill that is operating at a loss because no one has bothered to update the equipment in 15 years. And your tenants are one harsh winter away from revolt because their repeated requests for basic repairs have been ignored." Edmund stared at her. "I beg your pardon?" "Your accounts, Edmund. They're a disaster. You're so busy protecting yourself from dramatic threats that you're being destroyed by mundane ones." She set the ledgers on his desk with a decisive thump. "I can help, if you'll let me." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "You've been here less than a week." "Yes. Imagine what I could do with a month." He picked up one of the ledgers, flipping through her notations. His expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders. "Your father said you were useless with figures, that you had neither the mind nor the temperament for such things. My father is a liar and a fool who lost half his fortune at cards and the other half to schemes any child could have seen through." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I am neither useless nor innumerate. I am simply a woman, which in his estimation amounts to the same thing." Edmund closed the ledger carefully. "And you wish to manage my affairs?" "I wish to be useful. There is a difference." She folded her hands to keep them from trembling. "You married me because I cannot give you children. Fine, but I can give you this. Let me." He studied her with those gray eyes that saw too much, and Margaret wondered if he could see the desperation beneath her careful composure. The need to prove that she was worth something, anything, beyond the womb that had failed her. "Very well," he said finally. "Show me what you found." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a rider who refused to give his name and departed before Margaret could question him. "Mrs. Burns." Hendricks brought it to the estate office where Margaret had effectively taken up residence, her expression suggesting the envelope itself might be contaminated. "From your mother," the housekeeper said, setting it on the desk as one might set down a dead mouse. Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately. Elizabeth Belrose's elaborate script. All flourishes and affectation. The penmanship of a woman who believed presentation could disguise substance, or lack thereof. The seal was her mother's personal stamp, pressed into red wax that had cracked during the journey. She should have burned it unopened. Instead, she broke the seal and read, "My dearest Margaret, how it pains me to write these words, knowing the distance that now separates us, both in miles and in the unfortunate circumstances that led to your hasty departure. Your father and I have spent these weeks in constant prayer for your well-being, tormented by the knowledge that we sent our beloved daughter into a marriage under such tragic conditions." Margaret's jaw clenched. Beloved daughter. The same beloved daughter they had sold without even packing her a change of clothes. However, Providence smiles upon us. Through the good offices of Lady Ashworth, I have been introduced to a physician of extraordinary skill, a Dr. Cornelius Thorne, recently returned from Vienna, where he studied with the most advanced medical minds on the continent. He has made a particular study of conditions such as yours, and has achieved remarkable success in treating women previously thought beyond hope. Dr. Thorne has reviewed the details of your case, which I took the liberty of sharing, as a mother's concern knows no bounds of discretion, and believes there is every possibility that you were misdiagnosed. The fever you suffered, while severe, may not have caused the permanent damage that Dr. Pemberton suggested. Modern medicine has advanced considerably, and what was once deemed impossible is now merely difficult. The words blurred as Margaret's hands began to shake. She forced herself to keep reading. I write to you not merely with hope, but with a mother's duty to her child. Dr. Thorne has prepared a course of treatment, a series of tonics and procedures that he believes could restore your fertility within 6 months. Perhaps less, if you prove responsive to his ministrations. Naturally, such specialized care cannot be administered at a distance. You would need to return home for the duration of the treatment. I have already prepared your old room. I'm sure Beatrice won't mind relocating temporarily. And Dr. Thorne has agreed to visit weekly, though his fees are considerable. Your father suggests that the Duke, being a man of substantial means, would surely wish to invest in the possibility of an heir. What man would not? I await your reply with a mother's eager heart. Do not delay, my darling. Every week you remain untreated is a week lost to the ravages of time and the hardening of your condition. Your loving mother, Elizabeth Belrose. Margaret set the letter down with trembling hands. For a moment she simply stared at it, watching the ink swim before her eyes as rage and something more complicated, something that felt dangerously like hope, warred in her chest. A cure, a possibility, a chance to be whole. Except, bad news, Your Grace. Mrs. Hendricks hovered in the doorway, her weathered face creased with concern. My mother has found a doctor who claims he can cure my infertility. The words tasted bitter. She wants me to return home for treatment. The housekeeper's expression hardened. I see. Do you? Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Below, the gardens were slowly recovering under the attention of additional groundskeepers she had hired. Roses that had grown wild were being carefully trained back onto their trellises, not tamed entirely, but guided into something approaching order. What if she's right? What if I was misdiagnosed? What if there's a chance? Your Grace. Mrs. Hendricks's voice cut through the spiraling thoughts with the precision of a blade. Do you truly believe your mother is concerned with your well-being? Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool glass. No. But that doesn't mean she's lying about the doctor. Doesn't it? The housekeeper moved closer. In my experience, when someone who has treated you cruelly suddenly offers salvation, it's worth asking what they stand to gain. Before Margaret could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Edmund appeared, still dressed in riding clothes, his dark hair disheveled from the wind. He had been out surveying the northern properties again, following up on the discrepancies Margaret had uncovered in the Yorkshire accounts. His eyes went immediately to the letter on her desk. What's wrong? Nothing. It's merely, Margaret began. But Mrs. Hendricks had already retrieved the letter and handed it to the Duke. Her mother has written, the housekeeper said flatly. You'll want to read it. Margaret watched Edmund's face as he read, searching for some reaction. But his expression remained impassive, that careful blankness he wore like armor. When he finished, he folded the letter with precise, deliberate movements. A miracle cure, he said. How convenient. You think it's a lie? Margaret heard the defensive edge in her own voice and hated it. I think it's a trap. Edmund moved to the desk, pulling out the chair he had ceded to her weeks ago and sitting with the weary air of a general preparing for battle. Tell me, Margaret, what do your parents gain if you return home for 6 months of treatment? I don't access, he continued, his voice level but cold. To you, to information about my household, my finances, my vulnerabilities. 6 months to work on you, to convince you that you made a mistake, that you could do better. 6 months to parade you before other potential buyers, because make no mistake, if this doctor fails to cure you, they will simply claim the Duke's household was so toxic it prevented the treatment from working. Margaret's throat tightened. That's quite a conspiracy you've imagined. Is it? He leaned back in the chair, those gray eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. You've been here 6 weeks. In that time, you've reorganized my household accounts, uncovered 3 cases of fraud, and negotiated better terms with half my suppliers. You've made yourself indispensable, Margaret. Do you truly think your parents haven't noticed? Haven't heard through the society gossip networks that the new Duchess of Crestmont is not, in fact, a decorative simpleton? She wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. Her parents had never done anything that wasn't calculated for maximum advantage. Even her name in the family ledger had been crossed out with precision. So I should ignore the letter, she said quietly. Dismiss the possibility entirely. No. Edmund stood and moved to the window, staring out at the same gardens Margaret had been watching. You should have the doctor vetted, thoroughly. If he is legitimate, if his credentials are sound, we bring him here. He treats you under my roof, where your parents have no access and no influence. He glanced back at her. But we proceed with extreme caution, and we trust nothing that comes from Belrose Manor. And if they refuse? If they insist I must come to them? Then we know for certain it's a trap. His jaw tightened. I told you when we married that you would not be used against me. That protection extends to you as well, Margaret. I will not hand you back to people who sold you like livestock. Something warm and uncomfortable unfurled in Margaret's chest. It was not affection. They were not affectionate, but it was something. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that she was worth protecting, even if only as an asset. I'll write to my mother, she said. Decline her offer. Suggest that if this Dr. Thorne is as skilled as she claims, he should have no objection to traveling to Crestmont Abbey. Edmund nodded once. I'll have my solicitor investigate the man's credentials. If he's a charlatan, we'll know within a week. He paused at the door. Margaret, your mother is right about one thing. Modern medicine has advanced. It's possible you were misdiagnosed. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. But if you pursue treatment, it should be because you want it. Not because they're dangling hope like a carrot to lead you back into their stable. After he left, Margaret sat in the lengthening shadows, her mother's letter burning like a brand on the desk. Through the window she watched the sun set over the wild gardens, painting the stone walls in shades of amber and gold. A cure. The possibility of children, of being whole. Or a trap, carefully baited with the one thing she had convinced herself she no longer wanted. She pulled out fresh paper and began to write. Dear Mother, I thank you for your concern, though I confess it comes rather late and somewhat suspect given the circumstances of our parting. The discrepancy was small enough to overlook. Margaret almost had. She sat in the estate office well past midnight, reviewing the household accounts by candlelight while Edmund attended to correspondence in the library. This had become their routine over the past month, working in separate rooms but under the same roof, occasionally crossing paths to discuss a tenant dispute or a suspicious invoice. It was not intimacy, but it was something approaching partnership. The error appeared in the third column of the monthly expenses, a duplicate entry for candles that amounted to less than £2, easily dismissed as clerical oversight. Except Margaret had reviewed these accounts twice already, and the duplicate had not been there yesterday. She pulled the previous week's ledger from the stack and compared entries. There, another small discrepancy. And there, in the week before, always minor, always easily explained, but following a pattern that made her skin prickle with unease. Someone was accessing these books between her review sessions. Someone was looking at her work. Margaret closed the ledger carefully and stood, moving to the office door. The hallway beyond was dark and silent, but she had learned the rhythms of Crestmont Abbey. The night footman would be stationed near the main entrance. Mrs. Hendricks retired to her quarters in the west wing by 11. The maids finished their evening duties by 10 and retreated to the servants' hall. No one should be moving through this corridor at this hour. She extinguished her candle and waited in the darkness, positioned where she could see the door, but remain hidden in shadow. The minutes stretched, marked by the ticking of the long case clock at the end of the hall. Her legs began to ache from standing motionless. She was being paranoid. Edmund's talk of assassins and family conspiracies had infected her imagination. Then she heard it. The soft scuff of a shoe on carpet. Too light to be Edmund's tread, too deliberate to be accidental. A figure appeared in the hallway, carrying a shuttered lantern that leaked thin slivers of light. Female, judging by the silhouette, wearing a servant's dark dress. The woman paused at the office door, listening as Margaret had listened, then slowly turned the handle. Margaret waited until the intruder was fully inside before stepping from her hiding place and closing the door with a decisive click. The woman spun, lantern swinging wildly. In the sudden illumination, Margaret recognized her, Sarah Pruitt, one of the upstairs maids, employed for perhaps 3 months. Young, competent, unremarkable in every way, except for the terror now written across her pale features. "Your Grace." Sarah's voice trembled. "I was just... The fire needed." "The fire has been dead for hours, and there is no ash bin in your hands." Margaret moved to her desk and relit her own candle with steady hands, despite the hammering of her heart. "You're here for the ledgers. The question is why?" The maid's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She was perhaps 19, with the kind of forgettable prettiness that would make her ideal for espionage. No one noticed the plain servants. Margaret knew that better than most. "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace. I was only... You've been copying my notations." Margaret pulled out the ledger with the duplicate entries. Small changes, easily overlooked, but they serve a purpose. You're tracking what I review, what I discover, what I report to the Duke. She sat in her chair with a calm she did not feel. "Who are you sending the information to?" "Please, Your Grace, I need this position. My family is being paid by someone to plant you here." Margaret leaned forward. "I'm not going to dismiss you, Sarah, not yet. But I will know who you're working for, and I will know what you've reported, or I will have you arrested for theft and let the magistrate extract the truth. Your choice." The girl's face crumpled. She set down the lantern with shaking hands and sank into the chair opposite Margaret's desk as if her legs would no longer support her. "It was your father," she whispered. "Lord Belrose." The words hit like a physical blow, though Margaret realized she had known. Of course she had known. Who else would care about the internal workings of Crestmont Abbey? Who else would need to know what the useless daughter was doing in her new home? How long have you been reporting to him? Since I was hired. He arranged the position, paid Mrs. Hendricks's nephew to recommend me. Sarah's words tumbled out in a rush. I send letters twice weekly. What you're working on, what the Duke discusses with you, who visits, what the household expenses are. And what does my father do with this information? I don't know, Your Grace. I swear I don't. I just write what I observe and leave the letters at the posting inn. A man collects them. I never see your father directly. Margaret's mind raced, connecting pieces she had not realized were part of a larger puzzle. Her father had not simply sold her and moved on. He was still watching, still scheming. But to what end? The letter from my mother, she said slowly. About the miracle doctor. You reported that I received it. Sarah nodded miserably. And that you refused to return home. That you showed it to the Duke instead. What else? What specifically has my father asked you to watch for? He wants to know if you, the maid's face flushed, if you're sharing the Duke's bed, if there's any chance of a child. The absurdity almost made Margaret laugh. Her father had sold her specifically because she was infertile, and now he was paying a spy to confirm she remained so. Unless... He doesn't believe it, Margaret said, the realization crystallizing with sudden clarity. My father thinks I lied about the infertility, or that the diagnosis was wrong. He thinks I might produce an heir after all. I don't understand, Your Grace. But Margaret did. She understood perfectly. An heir to the Crestmont fortune, a grandchild her father could claim connection to, could use as leverage, could manipulate for his own advancement. He had not sold her to be rid of her. He had positioned her as a long-term investment. The office door opened without warning. Edmund stood in the threshold, still dressed despite the hour, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. Margaret at her desk, the maid in tears, the illicit lantern burning between them. We have a problem, Margaret said before he could speak. My father has been spying on us since the day I arrived. Edmund's face went very still, that dangerous calm settling over his features like frost. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Tell me everything. Sarah Pruitt told her story again, with Edmund listening in silence that somehow felt more menacing than rage. When the maid finished, he turned to Margaret. You knew something was wrong with the accounts. I suspected someone was accessing them. I didn't know why until now. Margaret stood, pacing to the window, though there was nothing to see in the darkness beyond. My father is tracking our household, looking for weaknesses, waiting for what? An opportunity? To reclaim his investment. Edmund's voice was cold. You said yourself you've made yourself indispensable here. You've proven you have value beyond childbearing. In your father's mind, he sold you too cheaply. Now he's looking for a way to renegotiate. Or to use the information against you, against us. Margaret turned back to face him. He knows about the fraud I uncovered, the embezzlement. If he's been sharing that with your cousins, then they know I've been cleaning house. Edmund's jaw clenched. They know I'm no longer vulnerable to my own employees stealing me blind, which means they'll need to find other weaknesses to exploit. Like a wife whose loyalty might be questionable. Margaret felt sick. I've played directly into his hands. Every letter I've ignored, every refusal to return home. I've made him more desperate, more determined. No. Edmund moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He's made himself more exposed. Sarah, you will continue to write your letters. But from now on, Margaret will tell you precisely what to include. The maid looked up with red-rimmed eyes. My lord? We're going to feed your employer exactly what we want him to know. And when he acts on that information, Edmund's smile was sharp as broken glass, we'll be waiting. Margaret studied her husband's face, seeing the chess master beneath the austere exterior. You want to use me as bait? I want to turn your father's weapon against him. He expects you to be helpless, malleable, easy to manipulate. Show him what he wants to see while we prepare our defense. Edmund's gray eyes met hers. Unless you object to using your family's own tactics against them. Margaret thought of her name crossed out in the family ledger, of her mother's poisoned letter, of standing at an altar in a borrowed dress while her parents counted their profit. No, she said softly. I don't object at all. Good. Edmund turned to Sarah. Your next letter will report that the Duke and Duchess had a terrible argument about the doctor, that her Grace is considering her mother's offer after all, that there are cracks in the marriage. He paused. Can you write convincingly? The maid nodded slowly. Yes, my lord. But what happens when Lord Belrose acts on this information? Then, Margaret said, feeling something hard and bright kindling in her chest, we discover exactly what my father is planning. And we end this before he can use me against my husband again. Edmund's hand brushed hers, brief, almost accidental. And when she looked at him, she saw something new in his expression. Not affection, not yet, but respect, partnership, trust. Welcome to the family business, he said. Try not to get poisoned. The false reports began immediately. Sarah's letters painted a portrait of marital discord, the Duchess spending long hours alone, the Duke increasingly cold and distant, whispered arguments about medical treatments and unwanted interference. Margaret dictated each lie with care, crafting a narrative her father would find believable. A marriage fracturing under the weight of unmet expectations. It was exhausting work, maintaining two versions of reality. By day, she and Edmund presented a united front to the household staff who weren't compromised. By night, they constructed elaborate fictions for Sarah to report. The deception required a coordination they had not previously achieved, a synchronization of purpose that pulled them into closer orbit than either had anticipated. 3 weeks into their theatrical production, Edmund appeared at the office door well past midnight, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of wine that looked older than both of them combined. We should celebrate, he said without preamble. Margaret looked up from the letters she was composing, another false report for Sarah to copy in her own hand. Celebrate what? Your father took the bait. My solicitor intercepted a message from Silas to my cousin Richard, proposing an alliance. Edmund set down the glasses and poured with steady hands. He's offering information about our household finances in exchange for Richard's support in having our marriage annulled on grounds of fraud. Fraud? Margaret accepted the wine, her mind racing. What possible grounds? That I married you under false pretenses. That I knew about Dr. Thorne's treatment and deliberately prevented you from accessing it, thereby ensuring your continued infertility for my own purposes. Edmund's smile was sharp. It's actually rather clever. Paints me as the villain and you as the victim in need of rescue, while positioning my father as the concerned parent and your cousin as the noble rescuer. Margaret took a long drink. The wine was spectacular, wasted on her distracted palate. And, once the marriage is annulled, Richard gains access to, what? The properties that would normally pass to your heir? The Yorkshire estates specifically. They're entailed in a way that makes them vulnerable if my marriage is dissolved without issue. Edmund settled into the chair across from her, loosening his cravat with the air of a man too weary to maintain appearances. Richard has been trying to acquire them for years. Your father has given him the perfect lever. So we've confirmed the conspiracy. What now? Now we prove it. Publicly, irrefutably, in a way that destroys both of their reputations beyond repair. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the candlelight catch in the deep red liquid. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Tonight I thought we might simply exist. Without the performance. Margaret studied him across the desk that had become their shared territory. In the candlelight, the harsh lines of his face softened slightly, and she noticed details she had missed before. The faint scar above his left eyebrow, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the weariness that lived in his eyes even when he smiled. I don't know how to exist without performance, she admitted. I've been playing a role for so long I've forgotten what's underneath. The dutiful daughter? The broken one. She set down her glass with more force than intended. The burden. The disappointment. I performed gratitude for scraps of affection. Performed acceptance of my own worthlessness. Performed invisible so they could forget I existed while still residing under their roof. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and moved to the window, staring out at the gardens that were slowly being restored to their former glory. My father used to bring me to this office when I was 8 years old. He'd sit me in that chair and explain the family business, which relatives to trust, which to watch, which would kill me if given the opportunity. His voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. By the time I was 12, I could identify poisons by smell and knew 17 different ways to test my food for contamination. I performed the dutiful son, the careful heir, while sleeping with a knife under my pillow and trusting no one. That's horrific. That's survival. He turned back to face her. We're both performers, Margaret. The difference is that now we're performing together, which means we can stop performing for each other. The statement hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a wall she had not realized she was maintaining beginning to crack. I don't know who I am without the performance, she said quietly. The girl I was before the fever, she's gone. The woman I might have become if I'd been whole, she never existed. I'm just this. Someone who's good with numbers and bad at being what people expect. Edmund returned to his chair, leaning forward with an intensity that made her breath catch. You're someone who uncovered 3 cases of fraud in 6 weeks. Someone who reorganized a household that had been bleeding money for years. Someone who saw a trap in a letter that I initially dismissed as mere manipulation. He paused. You're someone who has made this mausoleum feel less like a prison and more like a home, which is something I didn't think possible. I'm also someone who brought a spy into your household and nearly handed your enemies the intelligence they needed to destroy you. No, your father brought a spy into my household. You discovered her and turned her into a weapon against him. Edmund's gray eyes held hers. Stop claiming responsibility for other people's betrayals, Margaret. You've spent your entire life apologizing for existing. I won't have you do it under my roof. The words should have felt like a command, but instead they felt like permission. Permission to be angry. Permission to fight back. Permission to occupy space without constantly justifying her presence. "I'm not going to fall in love with you," Margaret said, surprising herself with the bluntness. "I know that's what the novels suggest should happen. The cold marriage that transforms into passionate devotion. But I don't think I'm capable of that anymore. They took too much." "Good." Edmund's response was equally blunt. "Because I'm not going to fall in love with you either. Love makes you vulnerable. It gives your enemies leverage. It gets you killed in my family." He refilled both their glasses. "But I do respect you, trust you, value you in ways that have nothing to do with your womb or your bloodline or any of the things you were taught to believe mattered." "Partnership, then." "Partnership," he agreed. "Built on shared enemies and mutual benefit and the fact that we're both too damaged for conventional romance." Margaret felt herself smile, a real smile, not the practiced version she deployed for servants and solicitors. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "Then you've had a depressingly unromantic life." "I've had a depressing life in general. The romance was merely one aspect." She raised her glass. "To partnership, then. And to destroying the people who thought we'd be easy targets." Edmund touched his glass to hers with a soft chime. "To being underestimated. May we use it to our advantage." They drank in comfortable silence, and Margaret realized this was the first time she had felt truly at ease in his presence. Not performing the grateful wife or the competent duchess, just herself. Whoever that was. "Tell me something true," Edmund said after a while. "Something you've never told anyone." Margaret considered. "I'm not certain I was ever actually infertile. The doctor who examined me after the fever was my father's choice, his friend. I was 12 and delirious and in too much pain to question his conclusions. But I've wondered sometimes if it was a convenient diagnosis. One less daughter to provide for." Edmund's expression darkened. "You think he lied?" "I think he told my father what my father wanted to hear. Whether that constitutes lying or simply selective interpretation." She shrugged. "It doesn't matter now. Real or fabricated, the diagnosis served its purpose. It made me worthless in the marriage market, which eventually made me available for purchase by someone who wanted exactly that." "And if you discovered it was a lie? That you could have children?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, examining the question from all angles. "I think I would be angry. Furious, actually. But I don't think I would want to prove him wrong by immediately producing an heir. That would just be another performance. Look, I'm not broken after all. I'm useful." She met his eyes. "I'd rather be valued for what I can do than what I can breed." "Then we're agreed." Edmund raised his glass again. "To fruitfulness of the mind rather than the body. To being worth more than our biology. To being more than what they tried to make us," Margaret added. They drank, and in the candlelight of the estate office, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence and the evidence of their shared war against those who had tried to use them, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in 8 years. She felt like a person rather than a problem. And that, she thought, was worth more than any cure. The petition appeared in the Morning Chronicle on a Thursday, strategically placed between advertisements for patent medicines and announcements of upcoming society balls where it would be seen by everyone who mattered. Mrs. Hendricks brought the newspaper to breakfast with the kind of grim determination usually reserved for delivering news of deaths in the family. She set it beside Margaret's plate without comment, though her expression said everything necessary. Margaret read the headline twice, certain she had misunderstood. Concerned father seeks intervention in daughter's imprisonment. The article that followed was a masterpiece of manipulation, carefully constructed to portray Silas Belrose as a devoted parent tormented by his inability to protect his child from a monster of his own making. Lord Silas Belrose, of Belrose Manor in Kent, has filed a formal petition with the Court of Chancery seeking the immediate release of his daughter, the Duchess of Crestmont, from what he terms a marriage conducted under false pretenses and maintained through isolation and intimidation. In documents submitted to the court, Lord Belrose alleges that Edmund Calder, Duke of Crestmont, deliberately sought out Miss Margaret Belrose specifically because of her vulnerable position, having suffered a childhood illness that left her unable to bear children. Rather than offering the security and protection one might expect from such a union, the Duke has instead, according to these claims, imprisoned the young Duchess in his northern estate, preventing her from seeking medical treatment that might cure her condition, and isolating her from family and friends who might otherwise intervene on her behalf. I was a fool to trust him, Lord Belrose states in his petition. Desperate to see my daughter settled, I overlooked the Duke's true nature. He wanted a wife who could not produce an heir, not out of any tender consideration, but to prevent complications to his own inheritance schemes. My daughter is not a wife but a hostage, prevented from seeking the medical care that might free her from this terrible situation. Lord Belrose's petition requests that the court conduct an immediate investigation into the Duchess's living conditions and state of mind, with the possibility of annulment should evidence of coercion or mistreatment be established. Margaret set down the newspaper with hands that had gone numb. Across the breakfast table, Edmund continued eating with mechanical precision, though she noticed his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "He's claiming you're holding me prisoner," she said unnecessarily. "I noticed." Edmund's voice was dangerously calm. "He's also managed to imply that I'm both a fortune hunter and potentially dangerous to your health, all while positioning himself as the wronged father rather than the man who sold you for coal rights. The bit about preventing me from seeking treatment is particularly inspired. It makes him look concerned while suggesting you're deliberately keeping me infertile." Margaret felt a hysterical laugh building in her throat. "Do you think he actually believes this narrative, or does he know he's lying?" "Does it matter?" Edmund set down his fork with careful control. "Belief and strategy look identical when executed well. He's created a story the ton will find deliciously scandalous. The cold Duke and his imprisoned bride. Truth is irrelevant when gossip is this entertaining." As if summoned by the discussion, the butler appeared in the doorway, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Your Grace, there are visitors, rather a significant number of them. They claim to be representatives of various charitable organizations concerned with women's welfare, along with several journalists and—" He consulted the cards on his tray with visible distaste. "A magistrate from London who insists he has authority to conduct a welfare inspection." "Of course he does." Edmund stood, his movements controlled but radiating barely suppressed fury. "Show them to the blue drawing room, all of them. Let them see exactly how imprisoned the Duchess is." Margaret rose as well, her mind already calculating angles and strategies. "They'll want to interview me, separately from you, probably, to ensure I'm not being coerced. Then we give them what they want." Edmund's eyes met hers across the table. "You know what to say." It was not a question. In the weeks since they had discovered Sarah's betrayal and begun their careful counter-operation, they had developed an almost uncanny ability to anticipate each other's thoughts. Partnership, they had called it. Trust built on shared enemies and mutual survival. I know exactly what to say, Margaret confirmed. The blue drawing room was aptly named, decorated in shades that ranged from pale ice to deep navy. It had all the warmth of a winter sea, perfect for receiving unwanted guests. The delegation that assembled there looked like a parody of righteous concern. 3 severe women in the uniform black of professional do-gooders, 4 journalists with notebooks at the ready, and Magistrate Cornelius Webb, a portly man whose wig was slightly askew and whose expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else. Your Grace. The magistrate bowed stiffly to Edmund, then to Margaret. I apologize for this intrusion, but given the serious nature of Lord Belrose's allegations, the court felt an immediate inquiry was warranted. I understand completely. Margaret moved to the center of the room, positioning herself where everyone could see her clearly. She wore one of the gowns Edmund had commissioned, deep burgundy silk that fit perfectly, with lace at the collar that had probably cost more than her father spent on household expenses in a month. Please, ask whatever questions you need. I have nothing to hide. One of the charitable women stepped forward, tall, angular, with eyes that glittered with the zeal of someone who had found a cause. Your Grace, are you being held here against your will? No. I am here of my own volition as the Duchess of Crestmont. Margaret's voice was steady, clear. This is my home. But your father claims, my father sold me to the highest bidder and didn't pack me so much as a change of clothes. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. If you're concerned about my imprisonment, perhaps you should have intervened 3 months ago, when I stood at an altar in a borrowed dress while my parents collected payment for a daughter they deemed worthless. Shocked silence. The journalists scribbled furiously. That's quite an accusation, the magistrate said carefully. It's quite a fact. Margaret moved to Edmund's desk and withdrew a leather folder. The marriage contract is public record. You're welcome to review the financial arrangements. My father received mineral rights to 3 coal deposits, forgiveness of substantial gambling debts, and an outright payment of £5,000. In exchange, he surrendered all parental rights and obligations. She set the folder on the table between them. The word sale may be indelicate, but it's accurate. One of the journalists, young, ambitious-looking, raised his hand. Your Grace, Lord Belrose claims the Duke sought you out specifically because of your inability to produce an heir. Is that true? Yes. Margaret saw Edmund tense beside her but continued. My husband was very clear about his requirements. He needed a wife who could not be used as a breeding tool in his family's inheritance wars. I met those requirements. We entered into this marriage as a business arrangement with mutual understanding and benefit. So you admit the marriage is not, the journalist searched for delicate phrasing, conventional? I admit our marriage is based on honesty rather than romantic delusion. My husband didn't want children. I couldn't provide them. We suited each other perfectly. Margaret turned to face the charitable delegation directly. Is that what concerns you? That a woman might choose practical security over the lie of love? That I might prefer managing an estate and being valued for my mind rather than being discarded by parents who saw me as defective merchandise? The angular woman opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. Your father mentioned medical treatment. A Dr. Thorne who believes he can cure your condition. Are you being prevented from seeking this care? Dr. Thorne's credentials were investigated at my husband's expense. He's a charlatan who preys on desperate women with false promises and dangerous procedures. Margaret pulled another document from the folder. This is the report from 3 separate physicians, all stating that Dr. Thorne's treatments have resulted in permanent injury or death in at least 7 documented cases. My father knows this because I sent him the report 6 weeks ago, along with my refusal to submit myself to a quack's experiments. Edmund stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Lord Belrose's petition is not about protecting his daughter. It's about regaining control of an asset that is appreciated beyond his initial estimation. The Duchess has proven herself extraordinarily capable in managing complex finances and estate operations. She has value her father failed to recognize, and now that he does, he wants her back so he can sell her again, this time at a higher price. That's a serious accusation, the magistrate said. Then investigate it. Margaret's voice rang with a confidence she had not known she possessed. Interview the staff, review the household accounts, examine the correspondence. You'll find that I have complete freedom of movement, control over substantial funds, and authority that most wives never achieve. She paused. What you won't find is any evidence that I'm a prisoner, unless you count being trapped in a society that measures a woman's worth solely by her womb. One of the journalists, an older woman with shrewd eyes, spoke up. Your Grace, this is quite different from your father's portrayal. Why would he lie so publicly? Because, Margaret said quietly, he thought I would be too broken, too grateful, too desperate for his approval to fight back. He thought he could manipulate me into supporting his narrative, that I would be so afraid of scandal I would flee back to his protection. She looked directly at the magistrate. He was wrong. The room fell silent, except for the scratch of pen on paper as the journalists recorded every word. Edmund moved to stand beside her, not touching, but present, a united front. Gentlemen, ladies, you're welcome to conduct whatever investigation you see fit. Interview anyone in this household. The Duchess and I have nothing to hide. His gray eyes were cold as winter steel. But know that we will be conducting our own investigation into Lord Belrose's finances, his associates, and his motivations for filing this petition. And when we're finished, the court will understand exactly who the villain is in this particular story. Magistrate Webb cleared his throat uncomfortably. I believe, given the Duchess's clear and competent testimony, that an extensive investigation may not be necessary. However, I will need to file a complete report. Of course. Margaret smiled sweetly. Please include in your report that I consider my father's petition to be harassment of the vilest kind, and that any further attempts to interfere in my marriage or my household will be met with legal action for defamation and slander. The delegation departed an hour later, substantially less righteous than when they had arrived. Margaret watched from the window as their carriages rolled down the drive, carrying with them a story very different from the one Silas Belrose had tried to plant. That went well, Edmund said from behind her. He'll be furious. Margaret felt a strange exhilaration, as if she had finally stopped running and turned to face the monster chasing her, only to discover it was smaller than she remembered. The story in tomorrow's papers won't be about my rescue. It will be about his exposure. Good. Edmund's reflection appeared in the window beside hers. Let him be furious. Fury makes people careless. What happens next? Next, we destroy him completely. Edmund's voice held no anger, only cold calculation. We've been playing defense long enough, Margaret. It's time to attack. The carriage that arrived at Belrose Manor 3 weeks later bore the Crestmont crest in silver and black, pulled by 4 matched greys that cost more than Silas Belrose earned in a year. Margaret had chosen it specifically for that reason. She descended without waiting for assistance, her boots striking the gravel drive with decisive clicks. The deep green traveling dress had been made by London's finest modiste. The emeralds at her throat were Crestmont heirlooms, and her bearing was that of a woman who had learned to occupy space without apology. Behind her, Edmund emerged from the carriage with predatory grace, followed by 2 footmen carrying leather cases that held 3 months of carefully compiled evidence. The front door opened before they reached it. Margaret's mother stood in the threshold, her face pale beneath rouge that had been applied with a shaking hand. "Margaret, darling, what a surprise." "No, it isn't." Margaret walked past her into the entrance hall that had once felt so grand and now seemed merely shabby. The wallpaper was peeling near the ceiling. The chandelier needed cleaning. Everything carried the distinctive scent of genteel poverty, trying desperately to maintain appearances. "You knew we were coming. I sent word yesterday. Where is my father?" "In his study. But he's not receiving." "He'll receive us." Edmund's voice cut through Elizabeth's protests like a blade through silk. "Unless he'd prefer we conduct this conversation at the magistrate's office instead." They found Silas exactly where Margaret had known he would be, behind his desk, attempting to project authority from a position of obvious weakness. He had aged since she last saw him. New lines bracketed his mouth, and his waistcoat strained across a belly that suggested he had been eating better than his finances warranted. "Margaret." He did not stand. A deliberate insult that might have wounded her 3 months ago. Now it simply confirmed everything she had come to understand about him. "I see you've come to your senses." "Have I?" Margaret moved to the center of the room, claiming it with the same confidence she had claimed the blue drawing room at Crestmont Abbey. "Tell me, Father, what senses would those be? The ones that allowed me to uncover your embezzlement scheme with the coal rights? Or the ones that traced your gambling debts to 3 separate creditors who are charging you interest rates that will bankrupt you within a year?" Silas's face flushed. "I don't know what lies your husband has been filling your head with. These aren't lies." Edmund set the first leather case on the desk with a decisive thump. "These are bank records, obtained legally through my solicitor's connections. They show quite clearly that you used funds from your daughter's marriage, to pay debts you had no intention of honoring honestly." Margaret opened the case and withdrew the first document. "You told your creditors the coal rights were your own property, free and clear. You collected payments based on that claim. But the rights were actually part of my marriage settlement, which means they belonged to the Duke the moment the contract was signed." She set the paper in front of her father with a gesture that felt like laying down a winning card. "That's fraud, Father. Criminal fraud." "You can't prove." "We can prove everything." Margaret pulled out document after document, creating a damning pile on the desk that had once held her crossed-out name in the family ledger. "Here are the letters you sent to Edmund's cousin Richard, offering intelligence about our household in exchange for support in annulling the marriage. Here are the payments you made to Sarah Pruitt to act as your spy. Here is the correspondence with Dr. Thorne, where you discuss splitting his fees from my treatment 50-50. Elizabeth had followed them into the study. Now she sank into a chair with a strangled sound. "Silas, what have you done?" "What I had to do to protect this family." Her father's composure finally cracked, his voice rising. "She was worthless, Elizabeth. Barren. A burden we couldn't afford. I made the best arrangement I could. You sold me like livestock, and then tried to manipulate me back under your control when you realized I had value after all." Margaret's voice remained steady, despite the rage burning in her chest. "You planted a spy in my household. You conspired with my husband's enemies. You filed a public petition claiming I was imprisoned, knowing it was a lie, hoping to damage Edmund's reputation badly enough that an annulment would seem reasonable. And, in doing so, Edmund added, his tone conversational despite the steel beneath it, you committed at least 4 separate crimes that carry significant penalties. Fraud, conspiracy, defamation, and my personal favorite, attempting to interfere with a peer's lawful marriage for financial gain. Silas looked between them, his face mottled red and white. You wouldn't dare prosecute. The scandal would destroy Margaret's reputation, along with mine. Would it? Margaret leaned against the desk, looking down at the man who had taught her to apologize for existing. I've given this considerable thought, actually. The scandal of prosecuting you versus the scandal of letting you continue your schemes. And I've concluded that I don't particularly care about my reputation in a society that measures women by their wombs and forgives men everything. Margaret, please. Her mother's voice was small, desperate. Think of your sister. Beatrice needs to make a good marriage. If you do this, the scandal will... Will what? Make it harder for her to find a husband? Margaret turned to face her mother. Perhaps she should know what she's really worth in your estimation. Whether you'll sell her to when the debts become too pressing. At least she'll be prepared. Edmund withdrew a final document from the case. We're prepared to offer terms. You will sign this statement admitting to the fraud and conspiracy. You will publicly withdraw your petition and issue an apology. You will sever all contact with my cousin Richard and provide a full accounting of what intelligence you shared with him. And in exchange? Silas's voice had gone hoarse. We don't prosecute. We allow you to maintain the fiction that you're a gentleman rather than a criminal. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat across from her father, as if they were negotiating a business contract rather than the terms of his surrender. But understand this clearly. If you ever contact me again, if you ever attempt to use my name or my marriage for your own advancement, if you so much as mention me in correspondence without my explicit permission, we will release every document in these cases to every newspaper in London. You've become hard, Margaret. Her mother's accusation carried the weight of moral judgment. Marriage to that man has changed you. No. Margaret met her mother's eyes without flinching. You changed me when you sold me. When you crossed my name out of the family ledger as if I had died. When you sent me to my wedding without even packing my clothes. She stood, smoothing her expensive dress. Edmund simply gave me the resources to fight back. Silas stared at the confession Edmund had drafted, his hand trembling as he reached for his quill. You were always an ungrateful child. I was a sick child who survived a fever that should have killed me. I was a daughter who tried desperately to earn your love by being invisible and undemanding. I was a woman you deemed worthless and sold accordingly. Margaret watched him sign his name with savage satisfaction. But I was never ungrateful. I simply finally learned I had nothing to be grateful for. The signing took 10 minutes. Silas's hand shook badly enough that ink spattered across the confession. But Edmund accepted it without comment, blotting it carefully and folding it into his case. One more thing, Margaret said as they prepared to leave. She moved to the bookshelf and withdrew the family ledger, that sacred record of Belrose bloodlines and achievements. Her father made an abortive movement to stop her, but Edmund's presence kept him pinned behind his desk. Margaret opened to the page where her name had been crossed out in black ink. With deliberate precision, she tore the entire page from the binding. I'm keeping this, she said, as a reminder of exactly what you thought I was worth, and of how wrong you were. Elizabeth followed them to the entrance hall, her composure crumbling. Margaret, please. You can't leave like this. We're your family. No. Margaret paused at the door, the torn ledger page folded carefully in her reticule. You were the people who raised me. Family doesn't sell you. Family doesn't conspire against you. Family doesn't measure your worth in coal rights and convenient diagnoses. Then what are we to you? Margaret considered the question, studying the woman who had birthed her, but never truly mothered her. You're a cautionary tale, a reminder of who I might have become if I'd stayed in this house, apologizing for existing and accepting your assessment of my value. She stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, where the Crestmont carriage waited with its silver crest gleaming. Edmund handed her in with a courtesy her father had never shown, settling beside her as the footman loaded the cases of evidence. As the carriage rolled away from Belrose Manor, Margaret looked back one final time. Her mother stood in the doorway, weeping. Her father's face appeared briefly in the study window, already calculating his next move, despite his signed confession. "Do you think they'll honor the agreement?" she asked. Edmund followed her gaze. "Your father will try something eventually. Men like him always do. But we'll be ready." He shifted the curtain closed, blocking the view of her childhood home. "How do you feel?" Margaret examined the question honestly. She had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, perhaps even cruel. Instead, she felt something simpler and more profound. "Free," she said finally. "I feel free." Edmund's hand found hers in the space between them, squeezing once. Not romance, not passion, but something equally valuable: recognition, partnership, respect. "Good," he said quietly. "You should be." The carriage turned onto the main road, leaving Belrose Manor behind. Margaret didn't look back again. There was nothing there worth seeing. Just ghosts of the girl she had been and the parents who had tried to break her. She had survived them both. And that, she thought, as Crestmont Abbey appeared on the horizon, was victory enough. 6 months after the confrontation at Belrose Manor, Margaret stood in what had become her favorite room at Crestmont Abbey, the conservatory she had restored from its state of elegant decay. Where dead plants had once littered the space, now orchids bloomed in careful arrangements, ferns unfurled in corners that caught the morning light, and climbing roses wound up the iron supports toward the glass ceiling. It was not the wild abandon of the outer gardens, nor the sterile perfection of a formal hothouse. It was something in between. Controlled growth, purposeful beauty. She was reviewing the quarterly reports from the Yorkshire properties when Edmund found her, still wearing his riding clothes and carrying the scent of wind and horses. "We have a problem," he said, though his tone suggested it was not the dangerous kind. Margaret set down her pen. Another cousin attempting murder, or merely embezzlement this time? Neither. Mrs. Hendricks has received 3 letters this week from charitable organizations asking if we would consider taking in an orphan. He handed her the correspondence with an expression caught between amusement and consternation. Apparently, our lack of children has been noted, and certain well-meaning busybodies have decided we need a project. Margaret scanned the letters. They were polite but persistent, each one suggesting that a childless couple of means had a moral obligation to provide for the less fortunate. One even went so far as to suggest specific children, siblings whose parents had died of cholera, desperately in need of a good home. The Duchess of Hartfield's doing, I assume? Margaret recognized the handwriting on one letter. Lady Hartfield had visited twice in recent months, ostensibly to discuss charitable works, but actually to inspect the infamous Duchess who had publicly denounced her own father. Undoubtedly. She thinks we're tragic figures rattling around this enormous house with no children to fill it. Edmund moved to the window, looking out over the grounds that had been transformed under Margaret's administration. New tenants had been settled in repaired cottages. The home farm was actually producing profit. Even the stables had been reorganized with an efficiency that made the master of horse weep with gratitude. What do you want to do? It was such a simple question, and yet it contained multitudes. What did she want? Not what was expected, not what would quiet gossip, not what would fulfill some imagined duty. What did Margaret herself actually want? I want to read their proposal properly, she said finally. Not because Lady Hartfield thinks we should, but because... She paused, searching for the right words. Because there might be children who need what we can offer. Not parents, precisely, but something else. Safety, education, a chance to become something other than what poverty would make them. Edmund turned from the window, studying her with those gray eyes that had learned to read her moods. You're not suggesting this out of some misguided attempt to fill a void. No. Margaret was certain of that, at least. I don't feel void. I feel full, actually, of purpose and work and satisfaction in what we've built here. She gestured to the conservatory, but meant the larger estate, the household they had restructured, the partnership they had forged. But that doesn't mean we couldn't share it, if we chose to, on our terms. Not to produce heirs or continue bloodlines. God, no. The Crestmont line can end with you for all I care. Let your estates pass to some distant cousin who hasn't tried to poison anyone. Margaret stood and moved to join him at the window. But children who have been failed by their families, who have been deemed worthless by a society that measures value in all the wrong ways. Those children I understand. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a real smile, rare and transformative. You want to collect broken things and prove they were never broken at all. Is that so different from what you did with me? I didn't collect you. I purchased you. There's a distinction. And yet, here we both are, significantly less broken than advertised. Margaret felt her own smile forming. What do you think? Can Crestmont Abbey handle more residents who don't quite fit society's expectations? I think, Edmund said slowly, that this house has been too quiet for too long. My father filled it with suspicion and fear. I've filled it with cautious efficiency. Perhaps it's time someone filled it with something else entirely. They reviewed the letters together over the following days, investigating each situation with the same thoroughness Margaret applied to suspect invoices. The first two organizations were dismissed quickly. One had a reputation for placing children with families who used them primarily as unpaid labor. The other seemed more interested in the donation the Duke might provide than in actually finding homes for their charges. The third letter was different. It came from a small foundling home in York, run by a woman named Mrs. Petra Blackwood, who had a reputation for fierce advocacy and absolutely no patience for aristocratic condescension. Her letter was blunt to the point of rudeness, stating clearly that she had no interest in placing children with couples who wanted decorative orphans to parade at social functions, and that if the Duke and Duchess were looking for grateful, well-behaved charity cases, they should look elsewhere. I like her already, Margaret said, passing the letter to Edmund. Mrs. Blackwood arrived 2 weeks later in a carriage that had seen better decades, accompanied by 4 children who ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 13. She was a tall woman with iron-gray hair and the bearing of a general inspecting potentially hostile territory. Your Grace, Your Grace. She nodded to each of them with minimal courtesy. I appreciate your willingness to meet with us. Though I'll be frank, Most aristocratic households are entirely unsuitable for my children. They've been through enough disappointment without being placed somewhere they'll be treated as curiosities or failures. Then we're already in agreement, Edmund said. We have no interest in curiosities. What we're offering is sanctuary, education, opportunity to discover what they might become without the weight of other people's expectations. Mrs. Blackwood's sharp eyes assessed him, then turned to Margaret. And you, Your Grace? I've heard the stories about your father's petition, about how you were deemed worthless because you couldn't produce an heir. What do you want from these children? Margaret met her gaze steadily. I want them to know that their worth isn't determined by what they can produce or who they can become for someone else's benefit. I want them to learn that being different from expectations doesn't make them defective. She glanced at the children, who stood in a nervous cluster behind their guardian. I want them to have what I didn't, a home where they don't have to apologize for existing. Something shifted in Mrs. Blackwood's expression. The oldest is Thomas, 13. Brilliant with mathematics, but refuses to speak. Hasn't said a word in 2 years. She indicated a tall, thin boy with dark eyes that took in everything. The twins are Rebecca and Rachel, 10 years old. Their parents died of consumption. Rebecca reads at twice her age level. Rachel hasn't learned her letters yet and likely never will. She sees them backwards, gets frustrated, shuts down entirely. There are teaching methods for that, Margaret said quietly. Different approaches. I could work with her if she's willing. And this is Henry. Mrs. Blackwood's hand rested on the shoulder of the smallest child, perhaps 6, with a mop of red hair and a left arm that ended at the elbow. Factory accident killed his parents. Took his arm too. Most families don't want a child who can't do a full day's work. Edmund crouched down to Henry's level. I have a stable master with 1 eye and a groundskeeper missing 3 fingers. Do you like horses? Henry nodded, solemn and evaluating. Then perhaps you'd like to see the stables while Mrs. Blackwood and the Duchess discuss boring adult matters. Over the next 3 hours, Margaret showed the children and Mrs. Blackwood through Crestmont Abbey. Not the formal rooms meant to impress visitors, but the library where Thomas's eyes lit up at the mathematics texts. The conservatory where the twins marveled at the orchids, the kitchen where the cook, herself an orphan Edmund had employed years ago, had prepared biscuits with Henry's obvious preferences in mind. You've thought about this, Mrs. Blackwood said, as they watched the children explore the gardens under Mrs. Hendrick's watchful eye. We've thought about what kind of household we want to maintain, Margaret corrected. Whether that includes children or not. We want it to be a place where people are valued for what they can contribute, not diminished for what they lack. And if Thomas never speaks? If Rachel never reads properly? If Henry's arm limits what he can do? Then they'll still be welcome here, still be educated, still have every opportunity we can provide to become whoever they choose to be. Margaret turned to face the woman fully. I'm not looking for children to fix, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm looking for children who need a place where they don't have to be fixed. Mrs. Blackwood studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. They can stay for a trial period, 3 months. If at any point they're unhappy or mistreated or made to feel lesser, I will remove them immediately and ensure every foundling home in England knows the Duke and Duchess of Crestmont are not to be trusted. Fair enough, Edmund said from the doorway, having returned from the stables with Henry perched on his shoulders, giggling. Though I should warn you, once my wife decides something is hers to protect, she's remarkably tenacious. You may find it harder to remove them than you think. That evening, after the children had been settled in rooms that would need substantial reorganization to accommodate their new residence, Margaret and Edmund stood on the balcony outside the library. The sun was setting over the gardens, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Below, she could see Thomas examining the geometric patterns of the formal hedges while the twins chased Henry through the roses, his laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "We're going to be terrible at this," Edmund said quietly. "Probably. We have no experience with children, no model for what a functional family looks like, no idea what we're doing." Margaret leaned against the stone balustrade, watching the children play. "But we're excellent at figuring things out as we go. And we're very good at proving that the conventional way of doing things isn't the only way." Edmund's hand found hers, warm and solid. They had progressed to this over the months. Small touches that spoke of partnership rather than passion, comfort rather than romance. It would never be the grand love story the novels promised, but it was real in ways those fictions could never capture. "Your father would be apoplectic if he could see this," Edmund observed. "His barren daughter creating a family that has nothing to do with bloodlines or inheritance." "Good. Let him be apoplectic. Let all of them be." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We're redefining what it means to be fruitful, Edmund. Not through children of our blood, but through what we cultivate in our care. These children, this estate, this household, it's all growing into something that has nothing to do with traditional succession and everything to do with choosing what we value. A family of misfits and survivors. The best kind of family." Margaret watched as Mrs. Hendricks called the children in for dinner, their voices raised in protest and laughter. Built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual benefit rather than biological accident, on the revolutionary idea that people, all people, have worth beyond what they can produce or inherit. Edmund pulled her closer, not romantic but companionable. Two people who had learned to stand together against a world that had tried to define them by their deficiencies. "To being more than our biology," he said, echoing the toast they had made months ago in the estate office. "To being more than they tried to make us," Margaret added. Below them, Thomas looked up and raised his hand in a tentative wave. Margaret waved back, watching as the boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years smiled. Not broken, never broken, just different, like them all. And in the golden light of evening, with children's laughter echoing through halls that had known too much silence, Crestmont Abbey finally felt like what it had never been before. It felt like home. My lovely family. Margaret's story ends here. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If you watch this entire journey, from a girl whose name was crossed out in a ledger to a duchess who redefined family on her own terms, and you still haven't liked, shared, and subscribed, you're choosing to let stories like this disappear. You're letting the algorithm bury narratives about women who refuse to be defined by their biology, about families built on choice rather than blood, about finding worth in a world designed to make you feel worthless. I created this content because these stories matter. But they only matter if people actually see them. So here's my ask. Like this video, share it, and subscribe. Not just for me, but for every person who needs to know that being different from expectations isn't a death sentence. Leave a comment about what Margaret's journey meant to you. Be the person who chose to amplify a voice that deserves to be heard. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.